just a reminder that Family Connections is our parent training and information center, and they provide special education training assistance to families of children with disabilities. And so we're so happy to have Family Connections serving in this role in our state. And it's a great resource for parents, but it's also for districts and agency representatives. I see we've got some on here today from different agencies. And so it's really important. So we're going to talk about, and hopefully by the time you leave, we're going to understand the purpose of the IEP. We're going to identify those required components that are designed to that are meant to design and develop the IEP, and then some quality indicators of a well-written IEP. I actually have a checklist that you can kind of use to check the IEP. I've been doing this a long time. If I was paid for every IEP meeting I have been in, I'm sure I'd be a very wealthy person now. But one of the things I've learned is that we have to move away from compliance to our focus being on good programming. And because compliance is part of what we have to do, a lot of times we put a lot of emphasis on that, but I always like to start with that. If we really think about good programming, then we're probably going to end up with a pretty compliant IEP. And so that's important for us to remember as we move forward in this. All right, can't get my screen to change here. Let's see. There we go. So what is the purpose of the IEP? It is that individual piece. Sometimes we forget about it. It's all about the student and to meet their specific needs that they have. It's about us really involving students in that general curriculum. And it's about us watching their progress in the general curriculum. It's about moving forward. And so when we think about that, that helps us to frame our thoughts as we prepare for IEP, the IEP. I always like to go to the law. And so here's just a statement from the law about what special ed and related services and supplementary aids and services should be. My favorite is it should be based on peer-reviewed research. Now, if you know that term, a lot of the research in special education is done in small case sizes. And so peer reviewers look for that to see that it's replicable. And so we want to make sure that we're using evidence-based practices and that it's matched to student need. We do this, we put these things in place so that students can advance towards attaining the annual goals. That's our first thing, is looking at annual goals, to be involved in and make progress in general education curriculum. That's not classroom, it's curriculum. And then that they're able to participate with other children with disabilities and without in activities that they describe later on, which means school, our instructional time, but it also means non-academic time. And so when we're thinking about what we're doing, we're writing this statement. We're trying to get a good plan in place to deliver these services. The IEP, I always say it's a process, and it is also a plan. So we have a meeting process, we have a plan, and then we have provision of services. And so we want to look at those things and how each one of those should work. And most of the work should be done before we ever sit down at the table. And so when we think about that process, I like to think about the meeting process. And so we always start that with, there's a type of meeting that we're going to have. We got to make sure we've got the right team members there. And then we're going to the meeting. And there's some work that gets done during that time. But when we think about types of meetings, we know we have to have at least one annual review every year. That's called for in the law. So I always say, you got to have one more meeting in 364 days from the date of the meeting. But we also can have special review meetings. And those meetings can be had be held anytime any member of the team feels like we need to address issues within the IEP. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get to progress monitoring. So what does the law say about arranging these meetings and what they look like? Well, for one thing, they must be collaborative. So every member has a role to play. When we collaborate, we're all there. That includes parents, school personnel, agencies, and any others who have expertise. That means I'm always upset when people say, well, they sat in the meeting and they didn't say a word, because that's not really what we think about with collaboration. Everybody should have something to offer. And we're going to develop this well-written plan based on the strengths of the student, the concerns of the parent, and our most recent data. And that plan must help us. We must end with a written plan that helps us with the implementation and provision of services. And so this is straight from the law. And so I always like to go there. So when we think about, we've got this meeting and a process to get that meeting set up and who's there, then we want to think about the development of the IEP. And I always say we're kind of working around the general curriculum. Now, I will say in South Carolina, we actually do have some social emotional standards. They're not used a lot, but we do have them, but we have academic standards. And so we're looking at what's provided to all children. And then we're using assessment to develop a present level of performance, to then determine accommodations, modifications, supplementary aids and services. And then we get to those goals that are aligned to the standards to meet the needs of the child. Then we look at specially designed instruction and related services needed. And then I want to talk a little bit about progress monitoring and reporting, because this is the cycle that continues as long as that child has an IEP. So let's talk about that written plan that we all know and love. Every child has one. I will say that there's some requirements for that. And I talked about them just a minute ago. So notice I'm saying it twice. So it's important for us to know what needs to be in there. We've got to have a present level, and I did say present, of academic achievement and functional performance. We must have goals. We must show how progress is monitored and reported. And we must have a description so that everybody understands what the services look like and how they're to be delivered. And then we're required to give an explanation of the extent the child will not be in a general classroom and why. It's called our impact statement. We want to have good accommodations and modifications. And then we've got to tell the dates, the frequency, location, and duration of all services. And for students who are 13 or older in South Carolina, we have to address post-secondary goal and transition services. And this is coming straight from the law. South Carolina differs a little. I've got a couple of people from other states in that we start transition, post-secondary transition at 13. The law actually says 16. And so that's our difference in South Carolina. In South Carolina, we have one standardized IEP. I do believe that all of our, I think 83 school districts now use this. It's called the Enrich, or sometimes you'll see the word Frontline. That's their new name. System. It is supported by our State Department of Education. And it is meant to ensure that the state is monitoring to make sure that our forms are compliant and include all those things that are required in the law. And so every state uses every district in the state uses this. The nice thing is IEPs can be transferred from one district to another, and also much easier access than when I first started, when we were sending IEPs through snail mail or in a fax. And then lastly, so we've got our meeting process, we've got our IEP plan, and then we talk about those provision of services and those being delivered and implemented. And so when we think about provision of services, it includes many partners working together, and that includes our parents and our agencies. It's important that we build strong teams for provision of services and that we're working together. For school districts, they must follow the written IEP, must be based on peer-reviewed research. I talked about that, and we must monitor progress. And then it should follow high leverage practices for delivery of instruction. So let's talk about prepping for the meeting. I feel like if we did a better job prepping for our meetings, we could have efficient IEP meetings. I don't know about you guys, but I have been in some hours and hours long IEP meetings. And some of the time that's because maybe not enough work was done on the front end. And so we want to make sure that we are really strategic in prepping for the meeting ahead of time and creating a good draft of an IEP that all the team members are adding to. I feel for our special education teachers, and it's something, you know, I'm just going to take 1 minute and say this is, they are maxed out with teaching. Our shortage of special education teachers means less planning time than they even had before, and there wasn't a lot before. And so this is really crucial that we really address this in supporting them and helping them and understanding that this is a process that they need to have time to lead and work on. They become responsible for a lot of this, but the prep time helps us as we move forward. So I say there are 4 steps to prep: planning the meeting, reviewing existing data, and making sure we've got all the data we need, and engaging every team member to analyze the data and give input on the goals and services. And then we want to produce that draft IEP. And I'll talk about what goes into the draft, what I think should go in there, and then what we actually kind of settle when we get face to face. But if we can spend some time doing this draft, then with all team members being involved, we've got a great start to a meeting. So let's look at planning our meeting and the schedule, the notice, and the selection of team members. I won't spend forever on this, but it's important to know that parents need to be notified early enough to ensure they have an opportunity to attend. And the meeting must be scheduled at a mutually agreed on time and place. I want to be very clear. Districts can't just send, hey, this is when our meeting is, because the law says it has to be mutually agreed upon. And so we want to make sure that, that we are trying to do that. My word, I did this as a teacher, is I contacted the parent before I ever started scheduling a meeting to say, tell me sometimes you're available. And then I could work around those times with our school team. The notice. Now, I will tell you, the law doesn't say written, but I do think if school districts are going to prove that they gave notice, that should be written. It can be in a letter, it can be in an email, but it has to tell the purpose of the meeting. And so if we're going in to do one thing, that's what we need to stick with. If other things arise, if the IP team can cover it, great. If not, we may have to schedule another meeting. But the purpose of the meeting, the time, the location, and the participant roles who will be attending the meeting. It does not require that it be the name of the person, but we do need to know a local education administrator will be there, a special ed teacher will be there, a general ed teacher. Many school districts put the names of those people. I think that's great. It's just not a requirement. And then parents have a right to have a representative who has knowledge and expertise about their child. So this can be someone from BabyNet, this can be someone from DDSN, this can be someone from mental health. I've had parents bring support through their advocacy, family connections. They brought that, or a friend maybe. I sometimes go to meetings with parents and help them navigate this process. The real line there is knowledge and expertise about their child. And it doesn't just say educational expertise, just knowledge. And so sometimes it may be, I've had sometimes people from churches that are helping families navigate. That's fine. I always give the example of, we had a parent one time that wanted to bring a news crew in, and that would not be somebody with knowledge and expertise. They were there trying to get a story. And so I won't spend forever on this because I'm going to give you this presentation, and we want to make sure we get through everything. But this is the IEP planning team and their roles. And I do want to talk just very quickly about the role of parents and students. Having student voice, we know, particularly as students start to get in around 5th and 6th grade, having them engage in this process is extremely important. Having them starting to take ownership of their plans. I was very involved in a project in Berkeley County where we did student-led IEP meetings, and the power of those is just, and the research on them is very strong. And so I always like to talk about that. We got to make sure we have an administrator there, and remember their role is to be able to commit any resources needed. And this might be a story for another time, but remember they're not endless resources. IDEA funds only funds up to about 18% of what it costs to educate child's local revenue, and state revenue provides the rest of that funding. So when budgets get hit hard, it affects services. We've got that special educator with the knowledge of disabilities, and they know the student generally. And then our general educator, their big role is to bring that knowledge of the general curriculum and the data on use of accommodations and modifications. Our general educators provide us with what we need to know about how much we can modify, what kind of accommodations will work in classrooms. They play a huge role in the development of the IEP. We have to have somebody in the meeting that can interpret data. Sometimes that's a school psychologist. You may be in a meeting, you see that, but that can be other roles as well. Special ed teachers have that knowledge, gen ed teachers, school administrators have that knowledge. And then anybody who's providing related and supplementary services, agency representatives, and then we talked about others that may be involved in the meeting. So we can excuse team members from meetings, but there are some rules around that in the law. And the district and parent have to agree in writing. If they want to excuse the attendance of a member because it's not necessary because of the allocation of resources or their area of curriculum or related services not being modified or discussed in the meeting. So I always give this example. If we're just adding maybe school transportation and we're having a meeting to do that, we could excuse other related service providers from that meeting because their area of expertise is not needed. Just remember that the district and parent have to agree to that in writing. When I was a director, we just had parents agree to that, and we had a form that we had them sign. We can also excuse team members if there is something that has to do with that person's area, if they provide in advance of the meeting input for the development of the IEP. And they have to put that in writing, and it has to be, the parent has to agree again. One of the things, if you read about why this excusal was put in the law, it was because one of the complaints from families and school districts alike is it takes us so long to get everybody there. If we could excuse some people, it would help. And so I think we have to remember why we do that and what the requirements are. And I've given the reference of the, I've given the reference there to that law. And when you get a copy of the presentation, you can certainly check that reference to see that. So before the meeting, we want to suggest items for the agenda to the team so that data can be collected prior to the meeting. We want to make sure if there are things you're wanting to know about the child in the classroom, that we are looking at that ahead of time. That makes for a smoother meeting. And then also, if we know we're going to have a virtual meeting, we want to prepare ahead. And I have provided a virtual training tip sheet here that gives some ideas for making sure you're ready for a virtual meeting. Although I think we're all getting pretty used to those now. We have many of them. And so once we are I've talked about our agenda, things we want to make sure we cover. We're ready to review the data that we have, the existing data for the IEP. And we're doing this to develop that present level of academic achievement and functional performance. So we're developing the strengths of the student. And we always want to build a strengths-based IEP. So we need to know what they do well. We want to make sure that we know those personal weaknesses that the student has so we can develop that needs section. And then we want to be able to show how this disability impacts their educational performance and access to the general curriculum. We have to be able to give the reason that we're making a placement and having an IEP in special ed. And then, of course, we always want to have good data, particularly to establish that baseline for goal development and those needed services. And so those are the big pieces within the PLAF. And we want to think about using multiple sources of data. If you see one piece of data, there's a problem. So I like to talk about the three pieces that we have that are so important. The first one is what we call norm reference data. And this is that data that compares your child to other children. So when we see percentile scores, or some places use like MAP and their RIT scores, and we can see here's what we look at for a typical performance, and here's where the child is. And so this really is the baseline of supporting a need for special education services, but it also is it gives us evidence to where the child can really participate in the general curriculum and maybe just have some accommodations. And I think this is so important as we think about placement, because I've seen many children placed in a self-contained classroom when their need may have only been for reading. And we could have made accommodations and they could be in the general classroom for other areas. And so my background at first was specific learning disabilities, and we know there's so much we can do to accommodate. So when we think about that norm reference data, that's giving us our support for those placement decisions. We've got to have good diagnostic data, and that determines the specific areas where we're going to need to provide some specially designed instruction and related services. It should let us know those specific strengths and weaknesses. So I may be talking about literacy, and I say the child needs is working on phonics and also working on sounds and decoding, and I can give specific information. So if you looked at one of my IEPs, it might say the child knows 36 of the 44 phonemes. Those are more specific information, and I could show which ones. I may have some data to show what we're still working on. And then our progress monitoring data that's within the present level of performance, that's actually shows the effectiveness of instruction. Here's where they were, here's where they are now, and we're ready to set a new baseline goal. So it's important to see those pieces of data. There are different data sources that we use, everything from assessment results to direct observations. I do think grades are important to report, but remember, grades are very subjective and they're not always based on knowledge. There's different ways people grade things. So it's good to know, but it shouldn't be the basis for decisions. In your handouts, you'll have this. This is actually tools for data consideration that can be used for the different areas. And when we're looking for, where could we go to get data? So this is just a little guidance document. It's based out of some work that was done in an article in Council for Exceptional Children. And then we want to make sure that we have parent and student input on all of these areas. Academic and functional strengths is really important. that students and parents are able to report these. Any kind of private educational reports we have or medical updates, observations from the home, these are all important input that we want to have into the IEP. An example I give of this is if a parent has a child and they get home from school and they're working on homework from the time they get home till 3 o'clock until 9 o'clock at night, that's not typical and healthy. And parents need to report that so that we know we need to make some adjustments because we can do that. And so those are things that we want to make sure we're getting good input. And a way to do that, one of the handouts is a parent input guide that you can kind of use to list things. Some districts have a standardized parent input, but this needs to be given before the meeting. This is not something you're asking the meeting, do you have anything to say? These are thoughtful things that we want to think about ahead of time. Certainly, I love it if parents are fortunate enough to have their child in a tutoring program, reports from those tutors of things they're working on, if they have them in private therapy, speech, OT, PT. What are those people saying? If they're getting mental health counseling outside of school, we want that information. It's really important that we get that ahead of time as part of this looking at the whole child. And after we've kind of pulled that data and we made sure we have everything, if there's something else we need to get, certainly if we want to get another observation, those are things that we can do as part of that gathering of data. We want to have all of our team members to engage and look at that data and start what I call the problem-solving process that we do with a lot of things in schools. So we're going to look at the needs of that child, and then we want to be thinking about what are the outcomes that we want for this next year, what's doable, what's sustainable that we can put in place for the child, and what are the services that are going to be needed for that child to reach those goals. And so when we use that problem-solving process to think about how we do this, we always start with data. So now we're ready. We've got the strengths. We've got those weaknesses. We are going to be able to write that impact statement, and we're going to be able to get that data to establish the goals. And we know parents are going to be able to provide input on suggested accommodations and modifications, the goals for consideration, and services. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So we're now ready to draft that IEP because we've thought through that before we get to starting to write on the plan. And one of the things, and I'll just go back to this for 1 minute, when we think about parents engaging and giving input, they should be giving suggestions for goals, things they'd like to work on, certainly accommodations and modifications and any kind of services they feel will be beneficial. Now, just because a parent gives input doesn't mean it has to be written in the IEP. Then the team, if the team's not in agreement, then we need to have that discussion during the meeting. But if I've had parents give ideas and I'm going, yeah, that's really good, let's put that in the draft. Parents see their children in a different way than I saw children as a teacher. And so that's really important. So now we're ready to write that present level of academic achievement and functional performance, what we call the PLAFT. And a good one, I say, is the heart of the IEP. This drives everything. Time should be spent on this part. So in South Carolina, there are basically 4 questions. And I'm just going to go through these quickly. The first one is, what are the students' academic and functional strengths? So I have a few guiding questions here. I won't read them all, but I will talk about a couple. Remember, are we addressing those strengths relative to their peers and their own personal strengths? Is the data current? I always say about a month, maybe 6 weeks, because we tend to know that 6 to 8 weeks with instruction, there can be changes in how the student's doing. So we want current data. And do those strengths support placement in general education classrooms? And do they give us the strategies needed to develop a strengths-based IEP? It's really important. And then the next one is, what are their needs, academic and functional? And remember, when we think, and I should have said this early, when we think about functional needs, I probably should have defined that. Remember, that's everything from daily living skills to social, emotional, behavioral well-being, to our executive functioning skills like organization, time management, all on-task behaviors, all of those interpersonal skills. I love to refer to the profile of the South Carolina graduate. That's those skills that we know not only lead to success in school, but also after school. So we're going to look at what are the areas of need relevant to peers. A lot of times I do a lot of work on the behavioral side. So if I was looking at needs, I would be looking at a child that if they are showing a lot of minor discipline in the classroom, or they've got major office discipline referrals, we actually know what those look like on average in schools. And if they're receiving more referrals than we know from research, we should be addressing that. We can look at universal screening tools on social emotional skills to give us information. You may have some executive functioning measures that are done to look at. So we can see what those needs are that shows some discrepancy there. And this helps us to really come into what accommodations and modifications, what supplementary services will we put in place, and what special education services. Once again, data needs to be current, very important. And then the third question on the IEP says, how does the student's disability impact his or her involvement and progress in the general curriculum? The impact statement should define why the student's being placed in special education, bottom line. And it should be based on the data that's written above. And then finally, and I don't really like this part, there's just a section for parent and student input. And it does ask, has input being put in place? I always say if you do some of these questionnaires that go out ahead of time, or you've done a parent interview, you can certainly reference that in this section. You don't have to do a rewrite if the parents provided input above. So when I develop an IEP, I may have a report from the general education teacher, a report from the parent, a report from the special education teacher, and I might have some assessment data, and it's organized that way. And so if we've already said it, you don't have to say it again, but the law does require input. Now in South Carolina, we have this general overall view, which is that first part of the plat that we just went over, those 4 pieces. And then we have specific findings. And this is where our diagnostic data goes. And so in the findings area, you'll put the name of the area. So it could be literacy, it could be math, it could be fine motor skills, it could be behavioral. And then we're going to provide the current assessment tools that were used, and then specific diagnostic information. And I always say what you need to have in there is, if I'm a teacher getting this IEP, I should know what areas I'm going to have to really be developing instruction to address. So it's diagnostic in nature. And I've got to be able to establish the baseline to set the goal. So those findings should give that information so that I know if a goal is being developed, I've got data to do that. We can, I'm hoping that we're going to do a session just on how to develop good present levels and what one should have in more detail. After we've kind of put all the present levels and our specific findings together, I make the suggestion to teams that the next really thought process should be, okay, can we address those needs through accommodations, modifications, and supplementary aids and services? Because I like to think about going from the least intrusive to the most intrusive. And accommodations and supplementary services are in the general curriculum. And if we can address them there, let's address them there. So a prime example that I give of that is sometimes as students get older, particularly with specific learning disabilities, we see that they don't really need reading instruction anymore, but they are still going to need accommodations for reading because the speed of their reading is not such that it prevents them from getting materials quickly. So I may not have a goal specifically for reading, but I am going to address those needs and accommodations. And so I don't want to pull those children out of the general classroom or be providing something if it's not a need. So that's the way to kind of think about that and frame it. So when we think about accommodations, I've already talked about this. We want to have the strengths that enable us to select the general education environments for success and those effective accommodations. And so I always use this example of if we have students who have strong listening comprehension, then providing them with auditory is a great accommodation. If we show weaknesses that they don't have good listening comprehension skills, auditory is not going to be an effective accommodation for those students. And so we're not just looking at just one piece of data to make those decisions. And so when we're looking at building that, let's start with supplementary aids and services, and the law defines this. This is from the law. These are those services that are provided in the general education classes or other education-related settings. And they enable students with disabilities to be educated with their non-disabled peers. They are not the same thing as related services. The law actually separates those. And so they can be provided to the student or on behalf of the student. I always use some examples of educational interpreting is a supplementary service in the general classroom for a student with hearing impairments. Sometimes we have adult supervision during transition times for students. That would be an example of supplementary aids and services. It's in those general education classrooms or other settings. Training for general educators is a lot of times a supplementary aid and service. Accommodations are also used in the general classroom, and they're a change in how a student accesses and demonstrates learning and does not change the level of the content. And we're going to do a whole section on accommodations. So remember, this is the down and dirty overview. And so these are ways that we can increase participation and remove the barriers of learning. And so we do those through setting. We may have some different, an accommodation you'll see quite often is the student is seated in close proximity to instruction. Or we might put the child in a small group. That might be an accommodation. They're still expected to learn the same content. The presentation is the teacher design or delivery of instruction. That can be anything from guided notes. There are many examples of that. I love to see when teachers do that for all students and not just students with disabilities. I'm not sure why we can't get there, but one day we will. The way students respond to instruction, and then scheduling, how we break up their day, how we schedule their day. They're still expected to learn the same content. It's important to remember that instructional accommodations must match anything we're going to do in assessment. So the child has to be able to use that all the time. And I say that, but that doesn't mean just because something's not allowable, doesn't mean it can't be used during instruction. If it's going to help the child learn, and then we might gradually fade some of those accommodations. I'll hear sometimes people say, well, they're not allowed to use a calculator, so we're never going to allow them to use it in class. Well, we may want to think about that and fade that. With understanding of we know when they take SC Ready, they can't use it during certain portions of the assessment. Those are all questions, and there's no easy answers to that. Modifications are changes in what the student is expected to learn or demonstrate. And those expectations are prioritized. So I always say, I think about, I'm sorry I have so many personal examples, but I do. As a teacher, you don't really, I'm not the best science teacher, okay? So if I can take a child and have them receiving their content from that science teacher that has so much knowledge, and I can give them modifications, and the teacher knows that they're modifications of what that child's expected to know and learn, then that child's going to learn more. And so we want to think about those things, and they may not be learning everything. They may not master all the standards, but we're going to prioritize those standards and expectations for the ones that are most important, that have endurance and leverage, and then make sure that we spell that out in the IEP so that everybody's clear. I will say that when we start getting to high school credit, the district has to determine if the modification would be allowable for the student to earn a credit. And so that's something that has to be discussed. I have heard that people say if there are any modifications, they can. I do think it depends on what the modification is. Is it a modification to the standards or to the course requirements? And so there are some questions in there about selection of modifications. Some considerations. General ed has to have input in this. This can't be a special ed. Special educators, unless they're duly certified, they're not content experts. So general ed knows the contents that has to be covered. And we're looking on key critical skills. And we're kind of looking at, does the student's present level indicate a need to narrow the breadth and depth of the standards? And will they benefit from being in a general classroom with those modifications? Or where would they best benefit from receiving instruction? So once we kind of figured out, hey, here's what we can do in general ed, now we're going to talk about goals, because now we're getting into special services, special education and related services. And we want to have, notice I say standards aligned goals. So we're trying to be making progress towards the general curriculum. And so I always say this, if the child was working at grade level, they probably would not need to be in special education. So these are not standards grade level. They're aligned to where we want the child to be. And that's another whole training. So goals, measurable goals must be developed for all areas needing special education or related services where goals are required. And I'll get to that in a minute, because some related services don't require goals. And they must be based on skills that the student will need to access and progress in the general curriculum. Objectives are needed for students who are participating in alternate assessment. You can also have objectives in other areas, and some teachers choose to do that. That's fine too. Goals have to target a student outcome. They have to have the condition. They must be observable and measurable. In other words, you have to be able to see and count them. And then attainable in a 12-month period of time. When I work with teachers, I always say, when you present your goal, have your data sheet there of how you're going to measure progress towards the goal. It's kind of like being a lifelong member of Weight Watchers. I know where to chart the foods I eat and my weight on the mobile app. I know how the data is going to be collected. And so we want to make sure when we set goals that we know how we're going to know if the child is progressing on the goal, how that data is going to be collected. So here's just an example and non-example. Samantha will increase time on task during a class activity or assignment. That's observable. We can identify time on task. From 3 to 15-minute intervals, that's measurable. In all academic classes, that gives a condition. That's attainable in that 12-month period of time. And we know the skill is to increase time on task. So we should see good measurable goals. Here's another one very quickly. Given a 7th grade passage, there's your condition. They're going to improve skills in reading by increasing fluency. So my skill is reading fluency. And that is observable from 100 words per minute to 140 words per minute with 90% accuracy measurable on story retells. That's my condition. So I've given 2 conditions in that goal, which is okay. I'm measuring the total reading. I'm going to be looking at fluency and comprehension. And so some people separate those out. You can also put it in one. If you like it better separated out, that's fine too. And so then here's an example. The student will use a voice output device to indicate basic requests for assistance 100% of the time when requesting food, drink, restroom, activities, and rest. So I've given the condition, what their skill they're going to use, and then these objectives are actually task analyzed. So they're going from the least that they'll identify pictures, then they're going to touch, and then they're going to get more specific to make requests. And so I'm building that skill to get to that goal. So that's an example for a student who might be on alternate assessment. And then once I've got my goals, the team is ready to talk about what that specially designed instruction will look like. So in this section of special education services, related services, and I think our IEP and Enrich actually put supplementary services in this place too. What type of service, who's going to provide it? Will it be a direct service or will it be indirect on behalf of the child? So an example of an indirect service might be training for a family or training for general education teachers. We have to talk about the setting. And then, of course, we have to determine whether the services will be considered for extended school year. And we're not going to discuss a lot about extended school year, but we will later. And then the description of the services, a full description. I'll go through this a little bit more. Several of you have asked in the chat box, and I'm trying to monitor the chat box. This presentation will be shared with you. I'm going to stop just for a second there. At the end of the presentation, I think this is sent out at the end, and so that you can have it and have the resources that are available. And I've actually provided some references in there as well. So I'm trying to get to. So special education services is specially designed instruction. That's from the law. If you're doing the same thing that's done by everybody else, it's not specially designed. And it's provided to the student to meet their unique needs. This is from the law. It's very important. And so what the team has to consider is how much time will it take to ensure the goal is reached? And will these services be direct or indirect? What are they going to look like? Related services enable the student to benefit from special education services. It's not based on their performance in the general classroom, but they're needed for special education services to work. So, for example, my favorite example is I'm working with students to build their reading comprehension and reading fluency skills and vocabulary. But they also have a significant language deficit that is going to be addressed as a related service through speech services. So for them to be able to really benefit from that specially designed instruction, they're getting that related service. Same thing you might have with fine motor skills. I'm teaching students to write or to use technology, and so they're getting support through those services. Sometimes occupational therapy helps more on a consult basis for me as a teacher, did a lot with developing sensory activities for students because they sometimes have specific training in that. So that might be an indirect service. We could do a whole session on how to match those up. So we want to think about who is that service provider that's going to be able to help with the delivery of those special education services. One thing related services doesn't cover is any medical device that is surgically implanted. We think about cochlear implants a lot in that area. Some related services will have minutes and some will not. It depends on the service. So for example, transportation, if we're providing specialized bus services so the child can get to school to get their special education, those don't require minutes. And there's several others that may or may not require minutes. It does just depend. There should always be a good written description for each service that fully outlines what the child will receive. So here's an example that I did for I'm a student. So in reading, and I won't read through all this because you're going to get a copy of this, but you can see I put IMA will receive explicit instruction in reading in a small group for 90 minutes per day, 3 days a week, and 60 minutes a day, 2 days a week. So I know I've got speech language will be provided for 2 30-minute sessions. So I know there, and then there's going to be written language, explicit instruction in written language to include spelling will be provided for 30 minutes a day in a small group. Those are special ed services. And then I've got assistive technology services, and you can see here, the assistive technology specialist will provide direct instruction to IMA individually on the use of speech to text system and digital materials. Here's that next one is really an indirect service because the assistive technology specialist is going to make sure that digital materials are accessible and make sure that training is provided to teachers on how to use it. So, and then we've got a behavior one to address specific behavior. And so those should be, when we see this section of the IEP, it should fully describe we should know exactly what the child's going to get. So I've put all those services in place. I know my goals. And so in the IEP, we should know how progress is going to be monitored. I told you I thought it was a good idea for teachers to show a data collection sheet. I just think that's good planning because there's nothing worse than writing a goal and going, how am I going to even measure this? But it should clearly define how progress will be monitored. Some people use curriculum-based fluency measures. I will say that's still a great way for literacy, math, and writing. It is one of the most evidence-based ways for us to progress monitor. It may be direct observation, behavior that we're collecting on behavior, executive functioning skills, but we need to know exactly what that's going to be looking like. We need to know the schedule for monitoring and how it will be reported to the parent. I think the more often that we can look at that, the better off we are. And so the law doesn't give a specific time limit except to say it has to be as often as reports are given to general education. So most places, if they give an interim report, you should get a progress report on progress towards the goal. And I'm a big believer, and I think we still have to keep asking for this. We want to see data. I shouldn't just see words like progressing. I want to know how they're progressing. It's important. And I think when we can help teachers to have easy tools to do this, because in their defense, if they don't have good tools to help them and they're having to create all this, it makes it very, very difficult. And teachers have so much on their plates. And so I think when we can help to make sure, like I did reading fluency measures, and so I had a tool that did that, and I administer it to students every week, and I could quickly tell you how they were doing, and it plopped it in a nice graph and everything. Life is good in that way. So we get that draft complete that much. We've put present levels, We put our recommendations for goals and services. If there's anything that there's not some agreement on as people are looking over their draft, we'll want to have those conversations during the meeting. But if we have that draft ready and everybody's kind of had a chance to look at it, then we can kind of conduct a pretty efficient meeting and get it over. I hate to say this, get it over with, but I want teachers in classrooms teaching. I want them working with students. And so if we can be really efficient with this, then we can get to the determination of kind of least restrictive environments, extended school year, and then the considerations portion of the IEP. That's what we've got left to do. If there are any disagreements with input, then we need to discuss those clearly. So let's talk about that word, least restrictive environment, or LRE. LRE means that students with disabilities are educated with their non-disabled peers to the maximum extent possible. And I want to be clear that we have to discuss this because removal from general education occurs if the nature and severity of the disability prevents the student from achieving satisfactory with supplementary aids or services. So remember, they are supposed to be able to benefit if they're in the general classroom. And we have to think about this if our children are going to move quickly and make progress. So anyone who knows me knows that my two areas are literacy and behavior. And if I have a young child who is not learning to read, and we've identified that with that child with a specific learning disability in reading, and they're young in first grade, we need to intensify their services early. They need specially designed instruction. Sitting in a classroom for 90 minutes in general education and then pulling them out for just a few, if they're significantly already behind, we'll never catch them up. And we have to prioritize that they're going to learn and we're going to get those students reading. And then we can always fade those services. That's the goal, is to flip it so that we intensify early with what we know about early intervention, the science of reading, and then we can gradually release so that because if they can read, then we can make accommodations if they're not as quick, if they're not as fluent. There's lots of accommodations. That's one example that I think about. And so it's not just about that the child will always do better sitting in the general classroom. We have to have rich discussion and use data to make these decisions. And we have to think about those long-term goals. We do have a continuum of placement. Sometimes we forget about this. That's still in the law. It's everything from the school where the child will attend to maybe a non-resident school that's outside the student's attendance zone, an alternative school. There are schools that are designed for students with disabilities. I think about our school for the deaf and blind is one place. Some students do need to be in a residential setting. I've had students in that situation. Unfortunately, one of our continuums of placement is correctional facility, and I would rather see us not providing services there, if you know what I mean. However, if children are there, we're obligated by law to have services if they're still 21 or under. And sometimes we might include a private school placement. The IP team could determine that would be the best placement. We always want to start with trying to provide those services in the child's home school, but that's not always possible. I explain this a lot being a special education director. Sometimes if you can cluster services in one building, we can give more intensive services. So I give an example of when I was in Berkeley County, we had a pretty large hearing impaired program, and those programs were clustered in one school area, and we transported students because we could have everybody there to intensify services for those students. And so those are some things to think about, when we're having those placements. But we are allowed to have those. Placement in preschool is a little bit different. When they're 3 to 5, remember they're in their natural environment because we don't have public school for our 3 and 4-year-olds for all children. Sometimes that makes it difficult to deliver those services. But remember, students are entitled to those services, and the district is obligated to provide transportation if they're going to bring a 3-year-old in for speech or maybe for some instruction. And I didn't go a lot into the preschool area, but if we're looking at their cognitive, maybe their needs, some support, or are we going to send an interventionist out to their natural environment? The district is obligated to provide transportation. Now, sometimes parents say, I can bring my child. Sometimes there's some daycare places that will deliver children. That's great. But if not, that is part of the law. And then we have to give that final removal justification, and we have to talk about why the child is being removed. And the data should support the reason for the removal. And it's not for adult convenience. It's because that's the needs of the child. And that's what we're kind of looking at. Now, if you ever go to an IEP meeting, and some of you may have been to one and some of you may have not, there is a section at the front of the IEP that's called the considerations. When I work with teachers, I tell them do this at the end of the meeting because this is part of the law, but the law never said this had to be written in the IEP. But it does say that IEP teams have to consider these things and address them. I always say if you've gotten a well-written present level with needs, you've addressed them. And so I always like to go back and use this as a checklist because it is a written part of our IEP in South Carolina. And the first part is, does the student's behavior impede their learning or the learning of others? And if it does, then that should be addressed in the IEP. Does the student exhibit behavior that requires a functional behavior assessment? If behavior is impeding learning, there should be a functional behavior assessment. That is the way that we assess needs for behavior. And so if we've said that they have a behavior that impedes their learning, a functional assessment should be done. And does the student exhibit a behavior that requires a behavior intervention plan? That really depends on the results of the functional assessment. If we can cover it in accommodations, that would be good. If we have to have more, then that would be included in the behavior intervention plan. We may just decide we're going to have a behavioral goal and some accommodations, and we're not going to develop a full behavior intervention plan. It does depend on the severity of the need. Does the student have limited English proficiency? That should be addressed. If it's there, the IEP should be addressing that. Is the student blind or visually impaired? Does the student have communication needs? And does the student need assistive technology devices and or other services? I always say this part was added later into the law and it kind of got a tag on. But if we do a good job with the present level, we're going to cover all these things because those needs are going to be apparent. So I like to think of this as a checklist, and I like to do it at the end of the meeting rather than at the beginning. So let's talk about signatures on that IEP because now we're doing them electronically. The law doesn't require signatures, but there's a couple of things that they do require. Number one, we've got to verify that you received your procedural safeguards. You have to receive them at least once a year. Also, if you file a complaint, you should get a copy of procedural safeguards. There's some other times the law says you have to get them. But your signature is really a verification that you participated in the meeting and you understood the process. And so when you sign, that's when they ask you to sign there. Those are the two things you're signing. If you look on Enrich, that's what it says. You're not saying that you agree. That's not, the IEP's been written. If you're not in agreement, then there's another step you have to do. And so the first is you have to receive a copy of the IEP, and you must receive prior written notice prior to implementation of the IEP. And so I've given a little handout on prior written notice, what it maintains. I'm not going to go through all that because of time today, but the IEP can't be implemented until the parent receives prior written notice. And once they've received prior written notice, then they have options of what can be done if there's a disagreement. I am always a believer that I try to make sure that if we can't resolve things as a director, I always try to to come back in to see how we could resolve it. But the law does provide for parents to file a complaint. You can also file due process. I will say the complaint process to the State Department, if you file a parent complaint, that's an investigation for non-compliance. And so they will investigate to see if something is non-compliant. So due process is sometimes a little bit more involved. And so, and I'm not going to talk during this time about our resolutions because we do have a resolution, a training on dispute resolution, but there are ways to do that. My word of advice, being a former director, is that we really remember that in the beginning, we're trying to collaborate and come to consensus and view things and see things from different viewpoints. And that helps us as we do that. So that is the end of our basic IEP training. I do want to let you know there's some great tools and materials for families that you can order. We're in the process of creating even more now for families, and you keep your eyes open on the website for that. Also be looking for our future trainings that we're going to have in the areas more specific IEP information, and particularly looking at accommodations, talking about development of goals and how progress monitoring and how we can work together to make sure that we're progress monitoring. And we've got, before we close, and if there are any questions, I'll be glad if somebody wants to put questions in the chat box, that'll be great. But now we're at the end, and I'd like for you, if you'll take just a few minutes and complete the poll. And let me get it set up. There's just, you'll notice they're the same questions. And if you can complete that poll, that will be great. And our Family Connection partners will appreciate it so much. And I'll come back to this question. I'm going to give a minute for everybody to answer the poll. And I'm really hoping I have 2 people started. Perfect. And then I'll answer these couple of questions. And I want to thank you for doing this. All righty. Just while I'm waiting, I'm going to just answer a couple of questions. I have a question that they didn't agree with the IEP, so they're going to mediation, was supposed to be stay put, but the progress report is new IEP. I would have to look at that before I answer that. And I always tell people some of these are, it all depends. It depends on when the process for mediation started. And so that would help, to know a little bit more. And then I had a question of what's UDL. UDL is Universal Design for Learning. And so that means that's a whole thing about designing instruction so that kids can access it, all kids, not just kids with disabilities, but that we're removing barriers to learning. And universal design kind of started in the architectural. So we have curb cuts to help us get our buggies up and down, but they were really designed for people to access who might be in wheelchairs. And so we know that when we have good universal design for learning, when teachers use that, more kids can access materials. I'm going to stop sharing the poll and I'm going to share results, I hope. Okay. So, and I just want to go through these quickly. Parents should provide input on present levels of performance along with suggestions for goals and services. Absolutely, that's a requirement of the law. IEP team members can be excused from the meeting if parents in the districts agree and the parent signs consent before the meeting. That is true. Parents members can be excused, and remember, sometimes that really does help us get that meeting held quickly to get things in place. This is the trick question. The selection for accommodation is based on what individuals feel will benefit the child. Actually, it's based on data that we know will remove the barriers for learning. So I hope that a lot of times we put a lot of accommodations that we think, and we really want to have some data to support that they're going to be effective. And there are different kinds of data. And when we do our accommodations one, we'll go into that more. When parents sign the IEP, they are signing their agreement as the IEP is written, and they are not. And then the IEP cannot be implemented until the parent has received a prior written notice. And of course, we just kind of went over that. They do have to receive prior written notice and for the IEP to be implemented. And so they have to have time to receive it. That's what the law says. So I'm going to stop that share. And I am so glad, and I know that some of you may have some personal situations. I am going to urge you to contact Family Connections. They have parent partners that can help you navigate if you're ever having issues. It's just a wonderful service that Family Connection provides. And they can also get you in touch with people if you need additional help that can help and support you. It's been a pleasure for me to talk with all of you. I appreciate your time. I know this is hard. I miss being in person because I like to see people, but I hope this has been helpful to you as you navigate our IEP system. It's so crucial for the betterment of our children with disabilities. And so look for future trainings, and we look forward to seeing you and hope you have a wonderful holiday season. And take time to rest and renew. It's been a tough year. So take care. And just a reminder that an email will come out with the presentation and also with your certificate of completion.